The sun rests low over the London skyline. A Sunday, the city is mellow and unbusy. It was a day of rest, and the pace had slowed down. Londoners completed lax errands, weaved or cleaned, sat for the theatre, and passed the time on greens and in the alehouses. The royal court preoccupied itself with dances, ball games, and a variety of idle chatter in the houses of notables and in the royal palaces. But all the while, the mood was pregnant with excitement. The Queen, after all, was missing. That morning, they whispered, Her Royal Highness Catherine of Aragon had come down with stomach pains. She had soon entered labour, and had been hurried away into her private chambers under the supervision of her midwives. The rumours were true. Queen Catherine had indeed been whisked away, and had spent the last several hours in painful childbirth. The girdle of Our Lady, a sacred Catholic birthing aid fetched from Westminster Abbey, arrived at Richmond Palace from the other side of the river and was carefully wrapped around the Queen's waist. In an age without effective painkiller or anaesthetic, and with contemporary medicine denied by the austerely Catholic Queen, Catherine underwent great pain throughout the delivery. Nonetheless, before the sun had set, a baby had been delivered. The umbilical cord was cut, the head washed, and once the gender had been verified, the newborn swaddled in birthing garments. The nurses, serving as witnesses for the birth, watched carefully as the baby was lowered into the mother's arms. It was a confirmation of regal legitimacy. With permission, a servant girl left the hall and ventured into the palace halls. There, she informed a messenger of what he was to do. Tell His Majesty the King he has been born a son. Part 1. Departure. Catherine of Aragon's only son, Henry Duke of Cornwall, died 52 days after his birth in 1511. From there on, all of her pregnancies would be girls or stillbirths. This set the tone for Henry VIII's reign. From 1511 onwards, his policy would be determined by one sole objective: to give his dynasty a male heir. To achieve this one-minded goal, he churned through his father's well-curated finances, 2 chief ministers, 6 wives, 2 daughters, 1 sickly son, and the church. In the end, he needn't have bothered. His only living son died shortly after his ascension to power, giving way to Queen Mary, who then gave away to Elizabeth I, arguably the greatest English monarch of the early modern era. But more than that, his breaking with Rome sent England in an entirely new direction. It opened the door for England's eventual full conversion to Protestantism, transformed English national identity, and set the stage for the Spanish Armada, the Civil War, and the beginnings of the British Empire as we know it today. In some ways, the English state let go of the religion it had held onto for almost 1,000 years, just because one king really wanted a son. So what would have happened if, in an alternate world, the baby Duke of Cornwall had survived, and England remained a committed Catholic nation? Our point of departure starts in the 1510s. With Henry VIII satisfied with his wife, and with a healthy son to carry on his name, Henry VIII is advised to, rather than break with Rome and establish himself as head of the Church, buttress the Catholic Church and to more closely identify himself with Roman Catholicism. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chief minister and church official in our world, was already moving to centralise church power and reform its institutions before Henry's desire for a divorce absorbed all of the state's political capital. In this world, he would focus on the church and would succeed. Wolsey is our keystone here. He doesn't just remain a concerned bishop, but instead becomes a real reformer and agent of constructive change. He takes an axe to corruption in the church and begins a widespread set of structural reforms, supported fully by his monarch and, with a little browbeating, the church establishment itself. Institutions within the church would be reformed, the education and training of the priesthood improved, and the general clergy, already well aware of the issues facing the church, strengthened to actually begin to rebuild the church on a local scale. Wolsey would sell this to his king similarly to what was done in our world by integrating the church more closely with the Tudor state. The submission of the clergy, which happened in our timeline in 1533, was a church-wide pledge that basically subordinated the entire church structure to the English crown. In our world, rather than a trial run for England breaking from the church, it would be a means for the English state to grab more power over the church itself, and continue the general Tudor trend of state centralisation while allowing further religious reforms to take place. Over the period of Henry VIII's reign, these reforms would begin to bear fruit, but it would be a lengthy process beset with growing pains. The late medieval Catholic Church was really a parasitic organisation that utilised its monopoly over culture and social life to extract taxes, political power, and personal wealth from the people it claimed to represent. The priestly class was generally either overworked or impoverished, while a middle and upper rung of bishops and clerics lived literally as lords and minor gentry. Reform in England would likely consist of giving sizable concessions to the English state in terms of the appointment of bishops and theological discussions, training and educating more priests, and clamping down on church discipline. England would be the first nation to implement these reforms fully, which were carried out across the church in our world, only much later in the timeline. In this way, you could expect England to become a controversial symbol of effective reform, the first Catholic nation to take action and to reform the church hierarchy. The English church would both be celebrated as a pragmatic defender of the faith and as a troublesome pseudo-offshoot that sought to defy the Catholic canon. You'd see sects and pseudo-Protestant offshoots form, likely led by charismatic preachers, which would be tenuously accepted or crushed as the state and the needs of the church demanded. However, an effect of maintaining the Catholic Church would mean that the English state would be much poorer throughout the 16th century. Henry VIII's later rule was basically bankrolled by his break with Rome, as it gave the crown a convenient excuse to seize church property. This famously included the monasteries and their great material wealth, but the real treasure was in the church lands, constituting between a fourth and a third of all land in England. This was a welcome windfall for the British state, and also pretty much financed all of Henry VIII's expensive wars in Scotland and France. This didn't make him solvent though. Despite his cash injection, Henry still overspent. By the 1540s, Henry VIII was selling off his newly acquired church lands for quick money, often to those who had been leasing said land, ballooning the size of England's landowning minor gentry, basically England's non-aristocratic, comfortable middle class. This had the side effect of turning said minor gentry into anti-Catholics and eventually full-fledged Protestants, as any Catholic return to power would threaten the property they now owned. After all, the church might want it back. In our world, this really killed any chance at popularly supported Catholic restoration. If the break with Rome opened the door to Protestantism, the seizure and then selling of church lands confirmed England's eventual full conversion. In this world, England's wars would be much more contained, likely minor, with single campaigns in France and a shorter, much less aggressive war with Scotland, rather than the multi-year-long slog endured in our world. By the time of Henry VIII's death, Catholicism would be much more secure in England. Catherine of Aragon would die later in our world, probably in the 1540s, and Henry VIII would follow soon in 1547. Protestantism would still remain constrained to the ports and the coasts of eastern England and the major urban centres of Bristol, London and Cambridge. Henry's son would take the crown in 1547 and be crowned Henry IX. This new Henry would grow up in the lavish court of High Tudor England. With his treasury empty and being traumatised by his father's late-age tyranny and spendthrift wars, he'd likely fashioned himself as a peace king. Similarly to Henry VII and Elizabeth I in our world, he'd be more financially conservative and politically careful. Raised a devout Catholic, his mind would be primarily concerned with the maintenance of the English Church. The state-ordered killing of heretics was pretty common during this era. Even the relatively tolerant Elizabeth I engaged in the practice, and so we'd see harsh repression of Protestantism alongside occasional bouts of religious tolerance. This new Henry would have to get married, likely as a prince, but it's difficult to tell you who. Despite having a Spanish queen on Henry VIII, Spain remained unpopular in England, and was fast becoming a realised threat to the balance of power in Europe. France remained the primary enemy, and Scotland needed to be pried away from their grip, meaning no alliance with France would last. You as the audience can probably pick any match, but I'm going to go with a black horse candidate, the Infanta Maria of Portugal. The daughter of the King of Portugal and Eleanor of Austria, she was supposed to be married off in our world, but was repeatedly delayed until she was too old to marry and was gifted a duchy as a consolation prize. In our world, with the option of an English prince and herself being only 10 years younger, par for the course for an early modern European royal marriage, Henry would marry Maria. This would serve to soothe Parliament's fears of growing Spanish power, ally England more closely with Spain's natural rival in Portugal without creating any actual military obligations, and it would help, of course, that the King of Portugal would be able to pay for an enormous dowry, and upon his death, Maria would inherit a great deal of the King's personal wealth. All of this would help to solve Henry IX's financial issues. On top of this, Maria was smart, thrifty, and could more than hold her own intellectually. With her sound financial mind and her general charisma, she may end up one of the few continental queens that the English people would really come to respect. If Henry IX was anything like his grandfather, or the real-world Edward VI, studious, intellectual, and highly cultured, the two would get along like a house on fire. With this boon, this latter Henrician age would take the place of Elizabeth I's own golden age in our world. There would be an explosion in literacy and material wealth, general European trade, and greater freedom in the labour market. This would, of course, come with the issues of vagrancy and unemployment that were found in our world. A law similar to our world's poor law would likely be implemented through the church to deal with the growing pains of a free labour market and the growth of enclosures, while feudalism would continue its slow evolution to something resembling an early modern economy. When it comes to foreign policy, the general policy of our world would remain in place, aka keep the great powers divided and France out of Scotland, which had been English foreign policy since the 100 Years' War. England would primarily find trouble in the Netherlands. The Dutch would still revolt in this world, and despite receiving no help from a Catholic England, sparing some Protestant private fighters, would still probably win. By the late 16th century, territorial waters around the Netherlands were not safe for Spanish ships, and the state finances were running low, and the Spanish armies were bled white. Even without a war with England, dynastic wars in France and crises elsewhere within the empire would eventually pull Spanish attention away from the Netherlands long enough to establish their independence and follow a path similar to our timeline, with their subsequent rise as a mercantile power. Concerned with the spread of Protestantism, but eager to see Spain excised from ports so close to England, the English would stay aloof, and Henry IX would attempt to position himself as a potential peacemaker in the conflict, not desiring to make an enemy of his trade partners in the Netherlands or his cousins in Spain. Following this trend, English foreign policy would eventually turn anti-Spanish. Spain's conquest of Central and South America, and the subsequent fantastic gold wealth that flooded into Spanish coffers, went on to fund Spain's wars of conquest across the continent. This was kicking into high gear in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. England coveted this vast gold wealth, and English privateers would raid Spanish shipping, eventually leading to volunteers and mercenaries heading to the continent to fight Spain and France, and the Netherlands as was done in our world. I'd imagine that this wouldn't lead to war, but likely several small conflicts, continuing indefinitely with the help of their allies in Portugal and Scotland. Throughout the Counter-Reformation, England would take a backseat approach, likely sending nominal help to the continent in order to assist their Catholic allies, but never committing too many resources in fear of sparking unrest in their domestic Protestant population, or risking their own strategic defence. For the inheritance, we're going to assume Henry IX would produce a son, and we'll name him Edward. This is going to be a controversial prediction, but I'll make a call here that young Edward would likely have been betrothed either during the years of his grandfather's reign, or the first years of his father's, to Mary, Queen of Scots. A Scottish princess marrying an English prince is more likely than it seems. In our world, Henry VIII attempted this, but continually placed obstacles in front of himself that he then tripped over. A combination of the fallout of his break with Rome, his delusions in believing that burning down Scottish villages would bring the Scots over to his side, and his general poor foreign policy, meant that James V and the Scottish Parliament rejected his betrothal agreements in 1544. In this world, Henry VIII succeeds in grabbing a betrothal agreement for his infant grandson, and both father and son approve. Rather than Mary Stuart fleeing to France, she instead often takes residence in England. Considering her established taste in princes, there's no reason why the two heirs can get along. The potential union would have basically been an issue of sovereignty, with the two realms nominally independent, to then be united in monarch only under the son of Edward VI and Mary, Queen of Scots. A prudent Henry IX could easily navigate this arrangement. Without a costly Spanish war, and with a more centralised and wealthier kingdom, Henry would leave his son a financially solvent and competitive state that had been mostly at peace for half a century. Edward VI would take the throne in the late 1590s, and rule probably until the 1620s or 1630s. Part 3. The British Crises. The more tolerant religious policies of Henry IX would only really prevented outright religious war. In our world, the only real way to resolve religious division in a centralised kingdom was basically to have a civil war. England would still have a significant Protestant population, mostly contained in small sects in coastal towns. In our world, Protestantism was imposed upon England from the top down, and the countryside and interior was only really converted by pretty much taking the pre-existing Catholic Church and turning it into a new Protestant Anglican one. It was a slow, deliberate effort, fraught with controversy, between competing Protestant ideologies within the Church and dissenting sects. Without this state to carry Protestantism into the interior of England, you'd find Protestants primarily on the coast and in large urban settlements with a large literate population. The Presbyterians would still spread in Scotland, mostly settling to the Midlands and Edinburgh, and you'd see a mixture of Lutheran, Calvinists, and later Puritan Calvinist sects emerge around the River Ouse, Cambridgeshire, and East Anglia. The Quakers, which were a significant Protestant movement in the Midlands, may also form in some way, as their ideas are not unique to their conditions in England, but rather drew from philosophical ideas common in Europe at the time. The regions mentioned were the wealthier, more middle-class parts of the country, and this makes enough sense. Protestants tended to be the wealthier and more dynamic people in society. Protestants would therefore punch above their weight considerably in terms of political and economic power. Nonetheless, these movements would be smaller and more persecuted than in our world, and would be much more prone to immigrate to America. It's likely that they would form at different times, many with different names and different leaders, and Protestantism would come to be dominated by competing sects, rather than a single Anglican church. English Protestants would overall possess characteristics similar to the French Huguenots or Dutch Calvinists, rather than the uniquely post-Catholic, hierarchical structure of the national church. I'll predict that something like 10 to 20% of the population would be Protestant by 1620. The main question is now, would the English Civil War still happen, if in a different form? I'd say yes. Although religion was a big factor of the English Civil War in our world, and the same would be even more true in this timeline, the British Isles were really ready to just erupt by the mid-17th century. In our world, the Irish were rebelling against disruptive English conquests, the Scottish were unhappy with English religious policies, and England itself was undergoing a mini secular crisis complete with elite overpopulation, skyrocketing unemployment, and the widespread application of the printing press as a means of spreading Protestant political propaganda. In the build-up to the English Civil War, Cambridge and Oxford received a record number of applications for certifications. New degree holders skyrocketed, and the number of pamphlets and newspapers grew substantially. People were becoming more literate, more furious, and more ready to experiment with new philosophical ideas for government, and this energy wasn't helped by the generally outdated and inefficient state administration left over from the age of Elizabeth I. As well as this, the trend of the age was for state centralization, to be followed by royal absolutism. Eventually, an army would be raised with personal loyalty to the king, and the king would turn the army around and crush parliament to institute personal rule. This narrative was buttressed by the fact that this had literally happened elsewhere in Europe, especially Prussia and France. Eventually, no matter the monarch, the parliament and crown would have come into conflict. In this world, the Civil War comes around a little earlier, likely during the final years of Edward VI's rule or the reign of his son. Protestants would mostly align with Parliament in the cities, with their ideas of popular sovereignty and self-determination, while hardcore Catholics would align more with the king in the countryside, with a moderate Catholic majority forced to choose sides from the centre ground. Looking at the map, you can pretty much see exactly who would win. Parliament owns the centre of production, trade, political power, and most of the population. Excluding a fluke victory where the Royalists managed to scatter the parliamentary armies and capture London, which almost happened in our world, Parliament would be victorious. The wars would be less drawn out than in our world. Charles I was uniquely stubborn, absolutely high on the idea that he was the divinely appointed King of England, and so literally any other monarch would be a better negotiating partner. In this timeline, the king settles with Parliament, reducing his prerogative and surrendering some rights. In the years following, it's likely that the Catholic moderates in Parliament seek to ally with the king to expel more Protestants in reaction to the war, creating a diaspora that primarily focuses itself on the growing American colonies. No matter what Parliament accomplished during the war, they would always eventually be undermined by a Catholic majority and a king with executive power, as no one was really ready to overthrow the monarchy entirely until Charles I burned away Parliament's goodwill and empowered the radicals. We should also mention Ireland, which at this point would basically be fully conquered by England. Unlike in our world, England would not force a mixed ideal of religious nationalism and racial supremacy upon the Irish. They'd instead follow the Tudor and Stuart example, allying with various Anglo-Norman lords and playing divide and conquer with the native clans and kingdoms. Rather than settling Protestants in Ulster and Dublin, the English would treat the Irish much as they treated the Welsh and later the Scots, selectively persecuting some groups while keeping others on side, and growing their control over Ireland they could centralise it into one singular Kingdom of Ireland under the control of the English crown. Without the genocidal conquests and land grabs of Oliver Cromwell, and later Protestant ascendancy under William III, Ireland's population would grow exponentially. Both an uplifted Irish gentry and a close relationship between the various kingdoms results in Ireland urbanising and growing more interconnected with Europe, becoming a strong base of support for the English crown and a base for recruitment of immigrants abroad. The Irish would retain their freedom-loving spirit, resulting in sporadic Gaelic rebellions, but the support for these would be low and the population generally content with Tudor rule, generally more similar to Wales than to Scotland. Part 4. Catholic Great Britain. Following the Civil War, I would predict that England would enter into a similar phase of warfare and territory expansion as seen in our world. England generally followed a cycle of a king turning to Parliament, granting some rights to wage an extraordinary war, going broke, and then turning to Parliament again when some new threat appeared to repeat the cycle ad infinitum. This allowed England to compete with other European nations throughout its history, despite a smaller population and economy, at least most of the time, by taxing its gentry heavily in return for their own participation in government. Compared to France or Spain, which worked out their own tax structure by effectively allying with the nobility to oppress the peasantry with heavy taxation, this was a much more inclusive system. By the end of the Civil War, and with growing wealth from trade in the American colonies, England would become a peer power to Spain and France through wars similar as to those seen in our world. England, and later Great Britain, would acquire long-coveted territories such as Jamaica and the Caribbean islands, all the while spreading their influence to Africa, India, and Gibraltar. British imperialism would continue much the same as it did in our world. In conquered territories such as Jamaica and Barbados, conquest would be led by Brits who owned land in Spanish territories, and the government would subsequently make treaties with the Creoles and Maroon populations to kick out Spanish plantation owners and to create a new power base that could repel any Spanish reconquests. In Canada and America, settlement would be spearheaded by basically deporting undesirables and Protestants as indentured servants and settlers, and by establishing royal colonies and charters for the farming of sugar, tobacco, and the agricultural goods needed to feed the cash cow of the Caribbean plantations. You'd probably see monarchy slowly retrench its power. Although Parliament would be stronger in England than any other European nation except perhaps Poland or Hungary, it would slowly fall back under the control of the monarchy, which would wobble over time between pseudo-absolutism and rule by parliamentary consent. With no Bill of Rights or glorious revolution, the monarchy would remain a powerful executive, at points governing with very little input by Parliament. This would only be reversed during large wars, political emergencies, or financial crises. Parliament can be controlled mostly by landowning Catholic Tories, rather than the more liberal Whigs, the latter finding themselves as an underdog party, with a large majority of Protestant sympathisers far more subservient to the king than in our world. I do think that Parliament would eventually win out, subordinating the king to the kind of constitutional position held by a modern president. More powerful than in our timeline, but with Parliament at the end of the day in control of the nation's policy. With this, England would arrive at the end of the early modern period, around the early to mid 1700s. It's an empire little changed at first, with a stronger monarch and a more dynamic colonial policy, but all of this will snowball. In the next part, we detail the empire into the future, the modern period, and the settlement of the American colonies and the rest of the Commonwealth. It should be out soon. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this alternate history so far.